When my son's fiancée arrived at the ranch, she glanced at my mud-covered boots and smiled politely. "You must be one of the ranch hands," she said. At dinner, she wrinkled her nose, pressed a silk handkerchief, ivory-colored edged and pale gold against it, and muttered, "That barn smell is ruining my appetite." I just smiled and kept right on eating. She had no idea she'd just insulted the man who built and owned the entire $60 million ranch. Welcome back to Grandpa's Revenge, where the stories we tell are the ones that stay with you long after they're over. If this kind of storytelling speaks to something in you, I'd be glad to have you along. A like and a subscribe means the world and keeps these stories coming. Before we get started, I want to ask you something from what you've heard so far. Whose side do you find yourself on, and why? Drop it in the comments. I read everyone. Now, a quick note: this story contains fictional elements added for the purpose of storytelling, and any resemblance to real persons or events is purely coincidental. What matters is the truth inside it. After nightfall, the ranch went quiet in a way that had nothing to do with emptiness. It was the quiet of a place that had weathered enough to need no further justification. 4 decades of pre-dawn starts and punishing winters had worked themselves into every timber of that house, into each fence post, each dark acre of Blue Ridge earth that lay breathing just beyond the glass. I had raised all of it out of bare ground. On certain nights when the wind cut through the cedar brakes and the cattle moved somewhere out in the darkness, the full mass of everything I'd built would settle over me the way a heavy coat does. I was at my desk, the lamp dimmed low. The Roanoke investigator's report sat open before me. 4 readings hadn't been enough. My eyes kept returning unbidden to a single paragraph low on the second page. A name, a date, a ranch in Bozeman, Montana. A 4-month engagement dissolved the very week after a net worth assessment came in, below what she'd hoped for. Huck raised his head from where he lay beside my chair, the lamplight catching the gray across his muzzle. 11 years old, and he'd long since earned the privilege of lying wherever suited him. Tonight, he'd decided to stay near. "You already know something's wrong, don't you, boy?" I said. Huck's tail knocked against the floorboards. Once, twice. Then his chin dropped back onto his paws, and those amber eyes stayed locked on mine. I closed the report and slid it into the drawer. Helen's photograph held its usual place at the corner of my desk. Her there in the vineyard, early days, knees dirty, laughing at something I'd said that I no longer had any hope of recalling. Every vine on that property had gone in by her own hands a full 3 seasons before we saw a real harvest. She'd come in from the rows at dusk, her palms stained dark purple, and tell me, "Gene, I believe we're actually going to build something real here." We did build something. We built every bit of it. I shoved back from the desk and went to stand in the window. The Blue Ridge stretched away into the dark beyond the glass. The live oak on the ridge, just a shape. The barn in the distance. And the first fence line I'd ever strung myself, 26 years old and so short on money. I was living on peanut butter 3 times a day straight from the jar. "I hope I've got her wrong, Ellie," I said to the glass, to the vineyard, hidden somewhere in the dark beyond it, to the oak on the ridge where the soil ran soft and the grass always came in thicker than anywhere else on the land. "I truly do." Huck came and leaned his weight against my leg. Reed had phoned 4 days back. There was a brightness in his voice. I knew how to read the particular brightness of a man performing confidence as much for his own benefit as for whoever he's talking to. "She's been wanting to see the ranch, Dad. She talks about it all the time." "Does she?" I had said. "You're going to love her. She's smart. She knows what she wants." "I'm sure she does," I had said. Then a pause short as a single breath fell between us on the line. Inside that pause lived everything Reed wasn't putting into words. The doubt he was carrying around just below the surface of all that brightness. My son came by his mother's instincts honestly. He just hadn't yet figured out how to let them lead him. I stepped away from the window and lowered myself back into the desk chair. The drawer stayed shut. Huck sank to the floor and let out a long exhale that was indistinguishable from giving up. "We'll see," I told him. "Come morning, we'll see." Sleep didn't come easy that night. Not out of anger. Anger had never been the thing that kept my eyes open. What held me awake was the specific ache of wanting to be wrong about a person, while every instinct you possess insists you're right. By the time the darkness outside had faded to that deep pre-dawn blue that shows up just before 5 in the morning, I was already pulling on my boots and turning my mind toward the north fence line. Certain problems yield to your hands. Those have always been my preference. The thermos wore a crack on the left side of the handle, patched over with electrical tape sometime back around 2008, never replaced. Helen had picked it out from a hardware store in Floyd the winter we'd finally built up enough in the bank that the electric bill stopped haunting us. She'd put it on the counter and told me, "You keep burning your hand on that old mug. Use this from now on." 14 years on the finish had rubbed away to raw metal wherever my grip always fell, and the lid needed 3 complete turns before it held. Newer thermoses had come and gone. Reed had set a shiny stainless thermos on the counter last Christmas with a note that said, "Dad upgrade," and I'd tucked it into the cabinet above the refrigerator and gone right back to my old one. I drew the first cup of the day at 4:58 in the morning, standing at the kitchen counter, the same as I had every day for the better part of 40 years. Huck was already stationed at the back door, tail sweeping slow, and even his nose working the gap at the bottom where the cold air leaked in. 11 years old, bad hip and all, and he still greeted every morning like it was the first one ever made. "All right," I told him. "All right, let's go." The Blue Ridge air hit me square in the face, cedar sharp and cold, clean enough that it nearly stung after a night spent indoors, stars still burning overhead, heavy dew on the grass, and from somewhere across the south pasture, one of the Hereford bulls let out a long, low call that rolled through the dark valley and dissolved into silence. My love for this place has never needed words to hold itself together. The night before, Clifford had left the barn radio, going the way he did sometimes. When I hauled open the barn door, what reached me first was a Patsy Cline song drifting out of the old Sony that had been sitting on the same shelf since 1996. Helen had set it there. She believed the horses settled better with music playing, and true or not, the radio had run ever since. I stood a moment in the doorway and gave the song its due. Huck pushed past me and made straight for his water bowl. The morning found its rhythm the way it always did on a working ranch. No hurrying, no dawdling, just the steady pull of things that need doing, and always have. I checked the cattle in the north pasture, scattered feed for the chickens, and walked the ridge fence line where 3 posts had been leaning since the last rain hit hard. One section had given out entirely overnight, a cedar post sheared clean off at the base. 2 hours in the drizzle with a post driver, and cold stiffened hands, the kind of concentration that doesn't leave room for anything else. When I finally made it back to the house, my coat had soaked through across the shoulders, and the red Blue Ridge clay had climbed the sides of my boots the way it always manages to after a rain. Huck ran ahead, up the porch steps through a full-body shake that sprayed water across the planking and clawed at the back door. Inside, Clifford was working through the dining room with the focused, unhurried movement of someone who'd already been at it a good while. I held up in the kitchen doorway and watched him. He was laying out the long table, the one that hadn't been set for a real dinner in 4 years, not since the Christmas before Helen took sick. He went around it with deliberate hands, setting each piece of silverware with the quiet attention that people reserve for things that mean more to them than they'll ever put into words. When he reached the far end, Helen's chair, he went still. He stood holding the linen napkin in both hands, and I watched his chest rise and fall on a breath that cost him more than the rest. Then, with slow and careful hands, he folded the napkin, laid it on the seat, and pressed it flat with his palm, gentle as a man settling something to rest. My throat tightened in a way I hadn't braced for. "You don't have to do all that, Clifford," I said. Clifford turned and looked at me across the length of the table. His face carried the expression it always did, composed unhurried 20 miles of road behind the eyes. "Yes, sir," he said. "I do." I emptied the last of the thermos into a mug and drank it standing at the counter, listening to Clifford work through the dining room, and left it at that. The rain had strengthened outside. Down the gravel drive past the gate and the cattle guard, a set of headlights swung off the county road and came rolling toward the house in no particular hurry. Reed's truck right on time. I set the mug in the sink, looked at the mud caked on my boots, and determined I had no time to deal with them. The truck pulled up about 20 FT from the front porch, and the passenger door swung open before Reed had even killed the engine. I watched from the kitchen window, both hands around the empty mug. The drizzle had turned the gravel a deep charcoal and raised that sharp, clean cedar smell off the trees along the fence. Reed came around the hood first, and then she got out. Natalie Dunbar was precisely what the report had described. Tall, assembled with the kind of care that costs real time and real money, wrapped in a cream-colored wool coat that had no earthly business being within a mile of a working ranch in November. She stood by the truck and let her gaze travel the property slowly, the way a person looks at something they are trying to put a number on. Not the ridge at sunset, not the vineyard roses going dark and wet down the south slope, the barn, the lodge cabins, the main house. Her eyes moved like a surveyor's, measuring and cataloging, filing each detail away. Reed put his hand at the small of her back and said something quiet near her ear. She smiled and let him walk her toward the porch. I put the mug down and went to meet them. Huck got there ahead of me. He came exploding out from behind the woodpile, the way he always did when Reed's truck came in, gray muzzle ears, flying not a shred of composure, his whole rear end swinging because his tail alone couldn't carry the weight of how glad he was. Huck, hey, buddy. Reed dropped to one knee right there in the drizzle and let Huck pile half into his lap, laughing while the dog tried to reach every inch of his face at once. Natalie stepped back. Not one step, she moved a full 3 feet sideways, her mouth going tight at the corners, chin lifting. Reed, she said, Reed, can you get him away from me? I just had these pants dry cleaned. Reed glanced up at her. Something crossed his face, quick, almost invisible, gone before it could settle. He's harmless. He just gets excited. I don't care if he's harmless, Natalie said. He's soaking wet and he smells like a barn. Huck turned his head toward her then. His tail eased off. Dogs read a room faster than most people do. He studied her a moment with those steady amber eyes, then swung back to Reed and pressed his nose against Reed's jaw the way he did when he was checking on someone. I brought Huck in with a low whistle. He came and settled against my leg, his weight leaning warm and solid. Natalie's gaze found me for the first time. She took in the coat, the boots, the long red streaks of dried mud up the sides. Her expression shifted, not rudely, not yet, but with the efficient ease of someone sorting things into 2 piles without making a production of it. You must work here, she said pleasantly, like she was doing me a favor. I've been here a long time, I said. It shows, she said. The property is beautifully maintained. She turned and went up the porch steps ahead of us without waiting. Reed caught my eye over her shoulder. I gave him nothing. He dipped his head one small tight and followed her up. At the front door, Natalie reached past the old wooden hook I'd put up there in 1988, the one I'd cut and shaped out of a cedar post on a Sunday afternoon, while Helen sat on the porch with a book, and she hung her Louis Vuitton bag right on it. The strap knocked the hook sideways. Helen's gardening gloves, the ones she'd left there the last spring she was well enough to work. The vineyard dropped to the porch floor without a sound. Natalie stepped over them and walked inside. I stood on the porch for a moment. The gloves lay on the painted boards, fingers bent slightly upward, the leather soft from years of use. I picked them up. My hands weren't steady doing it. I held them flat against my palm for just a moment, then hung them back on the hook where they belonged. Inside, Clifford was carrying a serving dish through the kitchen when Natalie stopped in the doorway and gave the room the same focused inventory she'd given the grounds outside. "Do you not have an espresso machine?" she asked. "Or at least an espresso." Clifford set the dish down. "Mr. Calloway uses a thermos, ma'am." Natalie spotted the old thermos on the counter, the electrical tape around the handle, the paint rubbed away to bare metal. She regarded it the way people regard something they cannot quite accept is still in service. How rustic, she said. The smell of pot roast and skillet cornbread had been filling the kitchen since 4 in the afternoon. Clifford had followed Helen's recipe the way he always did. The lodge cast iron skillet preheating a full 20 minutes before the oil went in the skillet, cornbread in the old lodge pan that had lived in this kitchen since before Reed was born. Natalie drew a breath through her nose, her expression shifting almost imperceptibly. "Is that what we're having?" she asked Reed. "Good home cooking." "Clifford's cooking," Reed said. "It's the best meal you'll eat this year." "I'm sure it's wonderful," Natalie said, in the tone people use when they mean the opposite. "I just thought for a first dinner, something a little more elevated might have been appropriate. A proper entree, something with some presentation." Clifford kept his eyes on the stove. His jaw moved once. Then he picked up the serving spoon and went back to work, as though she hadn't spoken. Huck sat beside my chair in the corner of the kitchen, watching Natalie with the patient, unhurried attention of an animal that has learned to trust what it senses and sees no reason to doubt itself. I looked down at him and thought, yeah, boy, me too. Clifford lit the candles on the dining table at 6:45, the way he had for every occasion Helen had ever considered worth marking. The room looked the way it always did when someone had taken proper care of it. the long oak table bright under the chandelier, silverware, straight water, glasses full. Helen had chosen that chandelier herself at a metal workshop on the south side of Roanoke 20 years back. She'd gone down on a Tuesday morning without a word to me, come home that evening with a receipt and a look that made clear no comment on the price would be welcome. I hadn't offered one. It was the finest thing in that room, and we both understood that without having to say it. I came in from washing up and took my seat at the head of the table. My boots were still on. The mud had dried to a rust-colored crust along the soles that shed a little with each step. I gave changing them approximately 4 seconds of thought, then decided that if this evening was going to show me what I expected it to show me, I wanted to be exactly as I was when it did. Reed held Natalie's chair for her across the table. She sat, smoothed her coat, looked up at the chandelier, and said, "God, how old is that? It feels very dated. Have you ever thought about replacing it?" The question fell into the room like a stone into still water. Reed's hand rested on the back of her chair, a beat longer than necessary after she was seated. "Mom picked it out," he said. "Had it made custom in Roanoke." "Oh," Natalie said one syllable, but she loaded that syllable with a complete opinion, an implied course of action, and a final verdict, all without technically committing to any of them. She had a gift for that. Her eyes continued around the room with the same measuring attention she'd used in the driveway, coming to rest on the wall beside the sideboard, where a framed photograph had hung in the same spot for 19 years. Helen in the vineyard, early spring, the vines just leafing out, her dark hair pulled back, knees in the dirt, laughing at something I'd said. The kind of laugh that takes over a person's whole face. "Who's that?" Natalie asked. Her voice was genuinely curious. Nothing more than that, which almost made it harder to hear. "A relative." Reed's gaze moved up to the photograph. When it came back down to his plate, something behind his eyes had gone away like a light switched off in a back room. "That's my mom," he said. "Oh, right." Natalie gave a small nod, one more glance toward the photo. "Of course, she looks lovely." She reached for her water glass and shifted her attention to Clifford, who had just appeared with a breadbasket. "Excuse me, do the staff here wear uniforms? It seems like that would make sense for a property this size." Clifford placed the breadbasket on the table with the steadiness of a man who has spent 31 years keeping his hands calm, regardless of what his ears are taking in. "No, ma'am," he said. "Never come up." Natalie was drawing breath to answer when Blythe pushed through the side door, a folder of project documents tucked under her arm, things that needed my signature before the week was out. Blythe had been running the lodge operation for 8 years. She was raised in Meadows of Dan, 20 May East, daughter of a man who'd spent his whole life tending land that belonged to somebody else. She understood this property, what it had taken to build it, what it meant, because I had explained it and she had listened. She pulled up short when she registered. Natalie read the room in a single sweep and sent me a look I had seen many times, the kind that asks, "How much am I allowed to say right now?" I sent back the one that means, "Not yet." Natalie swung toward Blythe with open, bright curiosity. "Oh, good timing. I've been wanting to ask, when did the family acquire this place? The bones are remarkable. I'm trying to piece together its story." Blythe laid the folder on the sideboard. "Mr. Calloway built it," she said. "Over about 40 years. A look of delighted understanding spread across Natalie's face, like someone who has just had a pleasing theory confirmed. "So it runs back to his grandfather's generation, essentially." She offered a satisfied nod, the nod of a woman who believes she has finally oriented herself on the map. That accounts for the feel of it. You can always sense when land has passed through the same hands for generations. It gets into the walls somehow. She tore off a piece of roll and smiled at Reed. "Whatever direction this place goes, we ought to build on that. People respond to heritage. It sells." Blythe's eyes crossed the table and found mine. The color drained from her pressed-together lips. The smallest shake of my head was all she needed. She gathered the folder, gave me one measured nod, the nod of someone who has been handed something fragile and knows it, and walked back out without offering Natalie a single correction. Natalie watched her leave. Then the phone came out of her bag. She tilted it upward, framing the chandelier, and took a picture. Reed sat watching her with his water glass suspended halfway to his mouth, not drinking, just watching his girlfriend point a lens at my dining room, the way an appraiser takes inventory. I pulled a roll from the basket and stayed quiet, but my gaze drifted to the window, to the faint dark outline of the vineyard pressed against the rain-soaked glass, and I thought about Helen in the early spring mud on her knees, working each young vine into the Blue Ridge soil, with her bare hands murmuring to them, the way she murmured to anything that needed coaxing to grow. Some things in this room she would never know were gone. I held on to that. She had the photo posted before the appetizers were half eaten. I could read the screen from my chair. Helen's chandelier from Roanoke caught in one corner of the shot, the oak table gleaming underneath it, the dark Blue Ridge night visible through the window behind. She'd run it through a filter that gilded everything, made it look warmer and richer, like a layout from a magazine about Virginia ranch life. The caption went up fast, both thumbs moving without hesitation. The way people move when they've done something 10,000 times. Future home goals, Blue Ridge, Virginia. Reed's hand found the breadbasket. His eyes stayed away from her phone, but the muscle along his jaw had pulled tight in a way I knew. Helen used to say Reed kept his feelings in that jaw, that if you watched that one place carefully enough, you could take his temperature without asking. She'd been right about it, same as she'd been right about most things. "Tag the county while you're at it," Natalie said, cheerful, tilting the phone for a second angle. "Geotagging is everything for properties like this. The reach is incredible. I have 18,000 followers, and half of them are exactly the demographic that would respond to something like this." "Put the phone away, Natalie." Reed said, quiet, no edge in it, but with a kind of weight underneath that hadn't been sitting there when the evening started. Natalie looked at him with the expression of someone absorbing a mildly inconvenient request, deciding to be gracious about it. The phone went into her bag. Her fork came back up. I pushed back from my chair and crossed to the sideboard to fill my water glass from the pitcher. There, Helen's grandmother's sideboard, hauled down from a farmhouse outside of Abingdon in the bed of a borrowed truck. Coming back to my seat, I passed within 4 ft of Natalie's chair. She angled her face away a slight turn, the way you shift from an open window in winter. Her hand went into the bag. Out came a silk handkerchief. Ivory-colored, edged in pale gold, the sort of thing that runs more than most households spend on a week of groceries, and she lifted it to her nose and mouth. Her gaze traveled across the table to Reed. Did someone skip the shower after the afternoon in the stalls? The question arrived in the same pleasant conversational register you'd use to mention the weather. "That barn smell is genuinely ruining my appetite. I'm not trying to be cruel about it. It's just very present." Clifford's grip tightened on the serving spoon. The knuckles went pale. He didn't shift from where he stood near the sideboard, but something in every line of him went rigid, the way a wire goes when the tension finally exceeds what the post can absorb quietly. Reed put his fork down on the plate with a sound like a door clicking shut. "Natalie," he said. "What?" She opened her palms a little, the handkerchief still in place. "I'm being direct. We're sitting down to eat. Surely that's a fair thing to raise." I stood at the far end of the table, water glass in hand, and studied her, the handkerchief and the precise way she was holding it. Not gripped, not hurried, positioned. The way someone positions a thing they have reached for before and know how to use. My mind went back to that afternoon, the north fence line, 2 hours of it in the drizzle, the post driver coming down through cold air, the shudder of impact moving up through my wrists and shoulders, and the clean, quiet satisfaction of driving something in straight and watching it hold. Huck had been parked 20 ft out the whole time, patient eyes on me, waiting until I was done. And I thought of Helen's voice. The week after we lost our first real harvest to a late freeze gene. The land doesn't owe us anything. We just keep showing up anyway. I moved my chair back out and sat down. Natalie went into the bag a second time. She brought out a small glass bottle, French expensive, the kind of fragrance that makes itself known a full 3 seconds before the wearer crosses the threshold, and held it up between 2 fingers. "Does anyone mind?" She asked the table generally, and without waiting on an answer, released 2 short bursts into the air between her chair and mine. The mist hung in the candlelight for a moment. Then it dropped. Reed's chair scraped back an inch. Both hands settled on the table, palms flat and still, as he pulled one long, measured breath in through his nose and let it leave even more slowly through his mouth. "There," Natalie said, tucking the bottle away with the brisk satisfaction of someone who has just handled a practical matter efficiently. She smiled at Reed and raised her fork. Now everyone can actually enjoy the meal. Clifford turned himself toward the wall behind the sideboard. 3 full seconds, he stood like that jaw-shifting gaze fixed somewhere in the middle of nothing, doing what I had watched him do across 31 years. locating that interior place where the anger runs thin because the work still demands to be done. I turned my eyes to my own hands resting on the tablecloth, the calluses laid across my palms, the scar on my right thumb from a barbed wire fence in 2002, the dark line under my fingernails that no amount of soap had ever fully lifted. These hands had pulled a calf from a frozen creek at 2 a.m. They had poured the foundation of this house. They had held Helen's hand in a hospital room in Roanoke until there was no more hand left to hold. I picked up my fork and kept eating. Beyond the glass door at the far end of the dining room, I could hear the rain working against the cedar planking on the back porch. Somewhere out in the dark, Huck would be curled up under the barn, Eve dry unhurried, waiting on me the way he always did. Reed was watching Natalie now with an expression I couldn't quite name. Something between grief and clarity, like a man opening a letter he has been putting off and discovering it says precisely what he was afraid it would. She reached for her wine glass and noticed me looking. No offense, meant she said pleasantly. These things just need to be said. Of course, I said, and I finished my water and put the glass down and left it there. Clifford brought the main course out with the quiet authority of a man who has fed people through worse evenings than this. Pot roast done from Helen's recipe card, the one still kept in the wooden box on the kitchen counter. Her handwriting on the tab faded now to the color of old tea. Buttered egg noodles with the skins left on the potatoes beside them, because that was how this family had always done it. Green beans from the garden that Clifford had put up himself in August. Skillet cornbread in the cast iron pan, golden across the top. The edges crisped the way they only get when a pan has been properly seasoned across 20 years of use. It was the finest meal I had eaten in longer than I could honestly say, and I had eaten it 100 times before. Natalie looked at her plate the way a person looks at something they have already decided not to enjoy before the first bite. A piece of dried mud broke free from the sole of my left boot and fell to the oak floor beside my chair, with a small flat sound that wouldn't have carried across the table. Natalie heard it. Her eyes dropped to the floor, to the small dark flake, then traveled slowly up my boots with an expression that sharpened as it climbed. Could someone please see to that? She directed the question at the room, rather than at any person in it the way people do when they have always been accustomed to being heard. Her hand gestured vaguely toward Clifford. Before it gets into the rug, it's an antique and it doesn't need ranch debris tracked across it. No, I'll get it, I said. I pushed my chair back and reached toward the floor. Please don't. Natalie's voice was firm, carrying the particular ease of someone who believes they are being sensible. That's exactly what Clifford is here for. There's no reason for a guest to tend to something like that when staff is present. It muddles the roles. I straightened back up. Clifford did not step toward the floor. He stood where he always stood near the sideboard, hands folded in front of him, eyes fixed on a point just above and to the left of Natalie's head, and he held himself still and waited. Natalie noticed after a moment that he hadn't moved. Her gaze went to him directly. "Did you hear me?" "Yes, ma'am," Clifford said. "I'm waiting for instructions from the owner of the house." Those words settled into the room the way a stone settles into still water. The ripples went out in all directions. Natalie's chin came up a fraction. A flush appeared high on each cheek. She turned to Reed, her eyes carrying the particular bright heat of someone whose authority has been questioned in front of an audience. "Your staff," she said. Keeping her voice level through visible effort is being spectacularly unprofessional. "I'd like you to handle that." Reed reached for the water pitcher at the center of the table. He filled my glass first, slow, deliberate, not rushed, then set it down and filled his own. When he looked up at Natalie over the rim, his eyes were perfectly unsettlingly calm. "Who do you think he is?" Natalie Reed asked. "The man sitting at the end of the table." Natalie looked at me then. Really looked the way she hadn't troubled herself to look since I'd walked in out of the rain. She took in the boots, the coat, the hands, the way I occupied the chair at the head of the table, like a man who had been sitting in that particular chair for a very long time. "The groundskeeper," she said. Her voice stayed pleasant, sure of itself, entirely unbothered. "Or someone senior in the property operation, someone who has given most of his life to a place like this, I'd imagine. You can always recognize people who have spent their years outdoors. There's a certain," she paused searching for the diplomatic word, "quality about them." Reed set his glass down. I looked at my boots beneath the table. The leather had cracked across the left toe from flexing 10,000 times over 12 years. There was a waterline from the flood of 2011 still showing as a faint mark above the ankle, the night I had waded into the pedernales in the dark to sandbag the lower fence and hold the south pasture. "I wore these boots the day we buried my wife," I said. Not loudly, no particular heat behind it, just a fact that seemed worth putting into the air at that moment. The ground was soft. It had been raining for a week. Something passed across Reed's face, a flinch, small and private, barely there before it was gone. He pressed his lips together and looked down at his plate. Natalie tilted her head. Her expression was patient and gently sympathetic in the manner of someone waiting politely for a feeling to run its course, so the conversation can come back around to practical matters. "That's a meaningful thing to share," she said. "Truly, but the mud is still on the floor, and Clifford is still standing there, and I'd really like to enjoy what's left of this meal." Without, she glanced at my boots once more, whatever that is, continuing to work its way onto the rug. Reed's index finger found the edge of the table. He tapped it once, twice, measured even like a man marking time. "Natalie," he said, "who do you think owns this house?" Natalie answered without a pause. That was what stayed with me afterward, not the answer itself, but the speed of it. The bright, unshakable certainty of someone responding to a question they believe admits only one possible answer. "Reed's family, obviously." She set her wineglass down and looked around the dining room with a small, settled smile. The smile of a person confirming something they have held as given all along. "It's been in the Calloway family for generations. That much is plain just from standing in the room." She speared a piece of pot roast with her fork. "Is there some reason that's complicated?" Reed looked at me across the table. I lifted my water glass, took a slow sip, and did not look back at him. "Not complicated," Reed said. "Just interesting." He turned to Natalie. "Tell me something. What would you do with this place if it were yours to run?" Natalie's posture shifted, that slight forward lean of someone who has been holding a prepared answer and has just been given permission to deliver it. She set her fork down and settled both elbows on the table, her wineglass held between her palms. "Honestly," she said, and looked around the room once more this time, with the focused energy of someone who had spent genuine time working through it. "A property this size in this location is being dramatically underused. The lodge operation, Aloneman Cabins, prime Blue Ridge location, you're leaving substantial revenue unrealized with the model you're running. We run at 89% occupancy," I said. Natalie looked at me. She had enough grace to look briefly surprised before her face settled back into the patience of someone offering instruction. "Occupancy isn't the number that matters. Revenue per available room is the number that matters. Reposition those cabins as luxury eco-retreats, proper amenities, a curated guest experience, the right marketing, and you could triple the nightly rate without breaking a sweat. People in Charlotte and Richmond are hungry for exactly this kind of property." Reed refilled my water glass. "And the vineyard?" Natalie turned toward the window without hesitating. The vineyard was gone in the dark and the rain, but she looked toward it anyway. The way people look at things they have already decided belong to them. "The vineyard is the crown jewel," she said, and something deep in my chest went very still. Properly developed as a wedding, an events venue, real infrastructure, the right partnerships, proper positioning, that section alone could bring in $800,000 a season. Easily. You have the land, you have the views, you have everything a backdrop needs. What's missing is the vision to make it earn, monetize. I turned my gaze toward the dark window. The vineyard lost somewhere out there in the black. Helen had put the first vines in the ground in early April 22nd years ago, the week after we'd gotten the bank, to extend our operating line for another season. She'd driven out to a nursery near Stewart and hauled back a truck bed loaded with bare root vines swaddled in wet burlap, then knelt in that Blue Ridge soil for 3 straight days and set every last one of them in by hand. Her knees had been bruised and tender for a week after. She never said a word about it. The first real harvest didn't come until the 3rd season. The 2nd year, a late freeze had taken out 40% of the crop, and Helen had walked the rows the morning after, touching each ruined vine with her fingertips, the way a doctor presses for a pulse, and said quietly, "We'll lose these, but look, these ones held." Her voice had never wavered. Her eyes had carried something that wasn't quite grief and wasn't quite hope, but occupied the territory between the two. I had loved her most in moments like that, when the world had just stripped something away from her, and she was already scanning for what was left. Reed was 11 years old when the first bottles came off that vineyard. He'd helped me haul the empty cases from the truck down to the cellar, solemn and proud, wearing a pair of boots 3 sizes too big that slid off his heels with every step. He'd looked up at me on the cellar stairs and said, "Dad, do you think Mom knows these are the best grapes in Virginia?" I told him his mother knew everything worth knowing. That was the plain truth. The livestock operation Natalie pressed on, drawing me back to the table, is charming, but it isn't efficient. Cattle, goats, sheep, the margins are thin across all of it, and labor costs eat into what little remains. I'd phase it out in stages and redirect those resources toward the hospitality side. Phase out the cattle, I said. And the goats and the sheep. Yes, keep a few horses for the guests. People love the idea of horses, but a working livestock operation at this scale is a 19th century model. You're running a Blue Ridge property in 2023. The market has moved. Reed eased back in his chair. His arms folded across his chest, and his index finger began to tap against his sleeve, that quiet, even rhythm that meant he was 3 moves ahead of everyone else at the table, and had been for some time. "Have you ever actually run a farm?" I asked her. Natalie regarded me with the patient smile of a professor, fielding a sincere but mildly naive question. "I don't need to run one to understand its economics. That's like saying you can't evaluate a restaurant without being a chef." She reached for her wine. "The data tells the story. You just have to be willing to read it." I looked down at my hands resting on the table, the calluses, the scar, the waterline on my boots left by the Pedernales flood. "My wife planted every vine in that vineyard," I said. "Took her 3 seasons to get the first harvest right. She'd come in at dusk with her hands stained dark and tell me we were actually going to build something here." Natalie's expression shifted by a fraction, not with any real feeling, but with the practiced warmth of someone who acknowledges a sentiment in order to move cleanly past it. "That's a beautiful story," she said. "Truly, but sentiment and strategy are 2 separate conversations. Right now, we're in the strategy 1. Reed's fingers stopped tapping. "I have understood for 68 years that the most dangerous moment in any negotiation is not the moment the other side raises their voice. It is the moment they go perfectly, entirely still." Reed unfolded his arms. He did it with the slow, deliberate economy of movement that Helen had always said made him look like his grandfather. Her father, a man who had served as a judge in Carroll County for 26 years and had never once needed to raise his voice in a courtroom to make every person present understand exactly where things stood. Reed picked up his water glass, set it back down without drinking from it. "Let me ask you something," he said to Natalie. She turned toward him with the attentive, faintly indulgent expression she wore when she was preparing to agree with something she'd already decided. "Who do you think paid to restore the main house?" Reed asked. "The foundation worked the roof, the electrical, all of it about 12 years ago. Who paid for that?" Natalie blinked. It wasn't the question she'd been expecting. "Your family's company. I'd assume it was expensed through the business." "And who founded that company?" "Reed." Natalie's voice took on the gently strained quality of someone being guided through something they considered self-evident. "Your grandfather built it, or your father inherited and grew it. I don't know the precise history, but it's clearly been a Callaway family operation for a long time. Why are you asking me things you already know the answers to?" Reed looked at Clifford. Clifford looked back at Reed with the expression of a man who has been waiting 31 years for this exact conversation and still has all the patience in the world remaining. "How long do you think he's worked here?" Reed asked Natalie, nodding in Clifford's direction. "Roughly." Natalie glanced at Clifford with the same brief categorizing look she'd been applying to every person in the room since she arrived, sorting them into useful, decorative, and inconvenient. "Most of his life, I'd imagine. People in positions like his tend to find a place and stay. It's a particular kind of loyalty." She said the word without any edge to it, which somehow made it land worse. Clifford's chin lifted by a fraction of an inch, the only acknowledgement he allowed himself. "And him," Reed said. His eyes moved to me, not a gesture, just a quiet level shift of his gaze. "How long do you think he's worked here?" Natalie turned her full attention on me, then the focused attention she had been withholding all evening, and I felt her take me in the way she'd assessed the property when she first stepped out of Reed's truck, measuring, cataloging, filing away. The boots, the coat, the way I held myself in the chair. "Probably his whole life," she said. "You can tell when someone has spent their life in one place. It gets into them." She said it without malice, and that was the worst part. She genuinely thought she was being observant. "People like him don't usually leave. They get comfortable. They become part of the place." She smiled at Reed, warm and assured. "It's something I actually respect. a certain kind of dedication. The fire at the far end of the room shifted and popped. Outside, the rain had found its rhythm again against the glass. Reed's finger returned to the table. 1 tap, 2, 3. "What if I told you," he said, "that I might not inherit any of this?" The smile on Natalie's face didn't vanish. It simply held suspended 1 beat too long, the way a note lingers after the piano key lifts. Then it rearranged itself into something that was still a smile, but meant something entirely different now. "What do you mean?" Her voice had dropped half a register. "Exactly what I said." Reed held her gaze. "What if this place doesn't come to me? What if the company doesn't come to me? What would that change?" Natalie's fingers tightened around the stem of her wine glass. A small thing barely visible, but her knuckles went from warm to pale in the space of a breath. "That's a strange hypothetical," she said carefully. "Humor me." She set down the wine glass, adjusted the fork beside her plate, drew a breath, and released it in a way designed to sound like patience. "Reed," she said, leaning forward slightly, her voice dropping as though the room had just grown private. "I can't build a future around a promise without a foundation. If the inheritance situation turned out to be different from what I understand it to be, then yes, we'd have to rethink things completely." She reached across the table toward his hand. "That's not cruelty. That's just being honest about what a life together actually requires." Reed did not take her hand. He looked at it lying there on the table between them, her smooth, unscratched hand extended across the oak toward his, and he did not move. "Completely rethink things," he said. "Meaning what exactly?" Natalie's hand stayed where it was. The color in her face had shifted from the high flush of confidence to something thinner and less certain. "Meaning," she began, "I didn't come out to the country to live alongside ranch hands and smell like livestock, if none of this is ever going to be ours." Reed's voice was flat. "What's coming next is the moment the whole evening has been building, toward the kind of thing that once it's out in the open, cannot be taken back. Before we get there, I want to ask you if you had quietly gathered proof that someone was working against the people you love. Would you confront them in the open or let them walk into it themselves?" Even as his eyes came up from the screen, Reed turned the phone over on the table. "That's word for word what you wrote, Natalie. A message you sent to your friend Amber 10 days ago." The wine glass went over. A thin red thread spilled down its side and opened into a slow dark stain across the white cloth, before Natalie's hand snapped out and caught it. The color left her face not quite pallor, more like vacancy, the way a room looks when everything's been carried out of it. "How did you—" Reed cut her off quietly. "I haven't finished. We're only just beginning." I watched Natalie's throat work twice before any words came out. Her fingers had stopped holding the glass and were now bunched in the tablecloth below the table's edge, pulling the linen toward her in a slow, almost unconscious drag. She didn't seem to notice she was doing it. "That message was private," she said. "A conversation with a friend. You can't just pull something out of context and—" "Month 3, Reed said. She went quiet. He hadn't moved, hadn't shifted, hadn't leaned in, hadn't raised his voice by a single degree. He sat the same way he'd sat through the whole evening, unhurried, and perfectly leveled, the phone resting in his palm, like he was simply reciting something he'd memorized a long time ago. "Month 3 get him to propose." He raised his eyes to hers. "That's not out of context. That's a numbered item on a list." Color rushed back into Natalie's face in 2 high spots on her cheekbones, her jaw set. "People think out loud. People talk through things with their friends. That doesn't prove—" "Month 6, Reed said. "Wedding." His voice never shifted register. "Month 8 begin vineyard lease paperwork with Mom." He let that word sit there. Mom. Like he was opening a door and waiting to see who walked through it. "Month 12 established primary residence at the ranch." Something cracked in the hearth, a sharp split of burning wood. Natalie moved her chair back from the table, not getting up, not quite fleeing, just putting space between herself and what was being laid out in front of her, the way you step back from a flame that's suddenly taller than you expected. She was breathing with great deliberateness, each inhale held and measured. "Reed, hear me out." The ease had gone from her voice. What replaced it was more careful, more stripped down. "Everything I've done, all of it has come from genuinely wanting to build a life with you. I think about the future. I talk things through with my mother. That's not manipulation. That's just how serious-minded women operate when something matters to them." "Your mother," Reed said. Natalie's eyes moved. just slightly, just once. Celeste Dunbar, Reed said, and laid the phone face down on the table. She's been looking into this property for 2 years. Did you know that? He watched her with something that wasn't anger. It was quieter than anger, the worn-out lucidity of a man who stopped being shocked a while back. She brought in an investigator from Roanoke, full workup on the property boundary, surveys, revenue projections, debt history, water rights, everything. Natalie's mouth opened. Nothing followed. The meeting she had in Charlotte 6 months back, I said. Both heads turned. I hadn't spoken in a few minutes, and my own voice surprised me, not unfamiliar exactly, but closer somehow, like I had moved nearer to the table without standing up. Your mother came and sat across from me at a conference table in Charlotte last May, I told Natalie. She was trying to work out a lease on a parcel of land near Galax. It didn't come together. Her company's history of paying contractors in this part of the state wasn't something I was willing to work with. I set my water glass down. She never found out it was me. My attorney handled all the contact. Natalie's gaze fixed on me. Behind her eyes, something was moving fast, sorting, recalculating, picking the pieces back up and fitting them differently. You knew. Barely a whisper. You knew exactly who I was. I knew the name the day Reed brought you out here, I said. Dunbar's not something you hear often in the Blue Ridge. That was 6 months ago. The last word broke in her mouth a little, like something under strain finally giving. You've known for 6 months and you said nothing to me. I wanted to be wrong. That was all. That was every word of the truth, and I didn't dress it up. My son had been happy. I had held on to the possibility that I was wrong about why. Natalie turned back to Reed. What came to her eyes now weren't performed tears, not the kind a person summons on cue. These were the reluctant kind, the ones that arrive against a person's will, and that they'd stop if they had any say in it. Her palms pressed flat on the table in front of her. Reed, no matter what you found, no matter what you think you figured out, what I feel for you is real. That was never part of any plan. Whatever else this was, that was always true. Reed's gaze went to her hands resting there on the oak, to the ring on her finger, the one I had stood for 2 hours choosing at a shop on Commerce Street in Floyd, because I had cared about getting it right, because at the time, I still believed the woman who would wear it had earned that kind of care. The vineyard lease, Reed said. Month 8 on your list. Do you have any idea what's actually out there in that section of land beyond the rows of vines? Natalie shook her head. Her tears were running now, cutting through her makeup in clean, thin lines. There's a live oak out there, Reed said. 200 years old, trunk about this wide. He opened his hands to show her. My mother is buried beneath it. She chose that spot herself because she had planted that vineyard and she wanted to remain close to it. His voice held without a tremor. That's what you had down for month 8. The noise Natalie made had no word in it. It was the sound a person makes when the floor they were certain of turns out not to be there. Clifford hadn't stirred from his place at the sideboard, but his chin had come down and his eyes had fallen shut, and what was on his face was the look of a man who has shouldered something heavy for a very long time and feels it in his bones. Outside, rain came down steadily without sentiment, the way Virginia rain does. It doesn't ask permission, and it doesn't explain itself. Natalie gathered herself the only way she knew not, by stepping back, but by pushing through. That was what I'd come to see in her across this evening. She didn't retreat to regroup. She regrouped mid-stride. The tears still marked her cheeks when she pulled herself upright, touched the back of her wrist to her face, and spoke. I didn't know about your mother. That matters to me. I need you to understand it genuinely matters. Does it? Reed said. Of course it does. She reached for the wine glass, registered. It was almost empty. Put it back. If I had understood there was something personal attached to that part of the property, I would never have... You'd have picked a different section, Reed said. That's the whole of it. For half a second, her expression slipped something colder and more calculating surface beneath the grief she was wearing, and then it was gone, covered again by a wounded, earnest look she carried as naturally as she carried her coat. Tailored, expensive, built to make exactly the impression it made. That isn't fair, she said. Which part? Reed asked. The part where I read the messages or the part where you wrote them? Natalie brought her lips together, drew a slow breath, and shifted her attention to Clifford. Would you take these plates away, please? Authority had returned to her voice, sharp and even. And fresh water, this pitcher's been out a while. Clifford considered the pitcher, 3/4 full. He looked at Natalie. He looked across at me. "I'll see to it shortly, ma'am," he said, in exactly the tone he used when he had no intention of doing so. Natalie turned back to Reed Clifford, already gone from her attention, before she'd finished the motion. "Reed?" She angled forward and let her voice go low, private the register she used when she wanted a conversation to belong only to the two of them. "Whatever's been said at this table tonight, whatever your father believes he knows about where I come from, I am here because I chose to be, not for the ranch, not for what's on paper or planted in the ground, for you. Can we go back to that? Can we just start there?" Reed held her gaze for a moment. Behind her the fire moved. The candlelight shifted. "He should eat in the kitchen." The words came down into the room, and everything in the room stopped. Reed's eyes sharpened. "What did you just say?" Natalie's chin came up. When she spoke again, her voice was measured and controlled, carrying the kind of certainty that doesn't need to be loud to cut. "I'm saying that for the remainder of this evening, it would be more comfortable for everyone if the ranch staff finished their meal in the kitchen. This is our first dinner here together. Reed and I would like it to feel that way." She let her gaze pass over me with the detached courtesy you might extend to a chair you've decided to move to a different corner of the room. "No offense intended. It's simply a matter of the right atmosphere." The candle closest to me wavered in some unseen draft. Reed had gone so still I couldn't see him drawing breath. Clifford's hand found the edge of the sideboard behind him. His knuckles whitened against the dark wood. A sound came out of him, not a word, not exactly a word, but the sound a man makes when something that has been pressing against the inside of him for a very long time has finally run out of space. I pushed my chair back. Not fast, not with any anger in the motion, but I rose from that table for the first time all evening, and when I was on my feet, I felt the full size of the room settle around me. The chandelier Helen had chosen, the photograph on the wall, the long table she had laid 1,000 times, the chair at the far end where she had always sat. Natalie looked up at me. In 31 years on this ranch, Clifford had seen me lose my temper exactly twice. Both times had been about an animal's safety. Both times it had been finished in under 60 seconds. He told me afterward that both times whatever room he happened to be standing in seemed to drop several degrees before I opened my mouth. Without thinking about it, he took one step back now, just his body making its own decision. Reed hadn't moved. His eyes were on me, not with concern, not with any warning in them, just watching the way he had watched me his entire life when something needed doing, that only one person in the room was going to do. I looked at Natalie. "What if I were Reed's father?" I said. Natalie blinked, a quick startled blink, at the blink of someone who has been studying a painting and just noticed the figure in it looking back. Then she laughed. It was a real laugh, genuinely caught off guard, briefly delighted, the laugh of someone who has heard something so absurd their body responds before their mind can stop it. She shook her head, touched her fingertips to her lips, and said, "You don't need to make jokes, really." "Why is it funny?" I asked. She looked at me with the patient, gentle expression of someone explaining a simple truth to a person who can't quite be expected to grasp it. "Because Reed went to the best schools, because of the way he carries himself, because," she gestured toward me, at my coat, at my boots, "the two of you come from completely different worlds. It's just obvious. That's not an insult. It's simply what's true." She said it the way she said everything, with total, unassailable certainty. And she meant every word. That was the thing I felt pressing against my chest like a hand, not the cruelty of it. She didn't believe she was being cruel. She believed she was being accurate. She had looked at me across this table all evening and seen exactly what she'd come in expecting to see, and nothing I had said or done or worn had given her any reason to look a second time. Reed stood up. He rose the way his grandfather used to rise, without hurry, without theater, to his full height, with the quiet authority of a man who knows the room will hold while he finds his footing. "Natalie," he said. His voice was very calm, the particular calm that isn't the absence of feeling, but its absolute contained presence. "I need you to listen to me carefully before what comes next." He did not look at Natalie when he began. He looked at me just for a moment. A look I had been reading for 30 years. The look that said, "I have gone over this completely, I know what I'm doing, and I need you to know that before I begin." I gave him one nod. He turned to her. 3 days ago, he said, "I got back to the apartment early. You were in the shower. Your phone was sitting on the kitchen counter, and a notification came through from your mother." He paused. Not for effect. Reed had never needed a pause for effect in his life. He paused because the next part needed a certain amount of air around it to land the way it should. I wasn't looking for anything, but the preview was right there on the screen, and once I'd seen the first line, I couldn't walk it back. Natalie's body went rigid in her chair. Her hands, which had been drifting toward her wine glass, stopped midway and fell to her lap. "Reed," she started. "I called my dad that night," Reed said. "Sat in the parking garage of our building in my truck for 45 minutes and talked through all of it. And then we decided to let this evening run the way it was going to run." He held her gaze without apology, without any of the cushioning people use when they know something is going to hurt. "We needed to see it, not just read about it. We needed to see who you actually are when you think no one is looking." Natalie's mouth opened. Her jaw moved once without any sound, coming out the way a person looks when they're trying to find a word in a language they've suddenly forgotten. "You set me up," she said, barely a breath. "We gave you an evening," Reed said. "You did the rest on your own." The fire cracked behind her. She flinched. "Everything tonight," she said slowly, and I watched her rebuild herself in real time, pulling the pieces back into position with the concentrated urgency of someone whose house is burning and is deciding what can still be carried out. "Clifford not doing what I asked. The way Blythe answered my question about the property. Your father never changing his boots." Her voice picked up speed as the shape of it assembled. All of it was arranged. "I said nothing was staged. Clifford didn't follow your instructions because in 31 years he has never taken direction from someone who had no standing to give it. Blythe answered the way she answered because I asked her to let you reach your own conclusions. And I didn't change my boots because I had been working on this property since 5 this morning, and I saw no reason to be sorry for it." Natalie looked at me, the full undivided weight of her attention fixed on my face for the first time all evening. And I could see the exact moment it happened. The moment the picture she'd been carrying since she stepped out of Reed's truck shifted, cracked, and began assembling itself into something she had never prepared for. "You knew who I was," she said again. But the words meant something entirely different now than they had earlier in the evening, before they had been an accusation. Now they carried something closer to stunned disbelief, the particular bewilderment of someone realizing they've been standing in the wrong room for a very long time. "I knew what your mother's company had done to 14 families in this county," I said. "I knew what happened in Montana 3 years ago. I knew about the property assessment she commissioned and the attorney she contacted in Roanoke." I reached for my water glass. My hand was completely steady. "I also know that my son was happy for 8 months, and I spent 4 weeks holding on to the chance that the happiness was real, even if what surrounded it wasn't." Reed's jaw tightened at that. He turned toward the window. For just a moment, the dark glass, the rain coming down, and in that one unguarded second, I saw what the past 8 months had taken from him. The brightness that had been performance, the weekly calls that had fallen away, the project he had shut down because she suggested it, the document he had signed because she'd handed it to him and told him it was nothing. My son had understood something was wrong for months. He simply hadn't let himself know that he understood it. "The document," I said to Natalie, "the letter of intent you asked Reed to sign in September. Your mother's attorney drafted it. It was written to give the Dunbar family a legal claim to priority negotiation rights over the vineyards section in the event of any sale or development agreement. Reed signed it because you told him it was a standard business introduction letter." Natalie's face drained completely this time. I didn't know the specific legal language she used. I only knew she needed." "Blythe found it," Reed said. His voice had gone very quiet, the kind of quiet that has its own weight. "She read the whole thing. She brought it to my dad the same day. That was 6 weeks ago." Natalie pressed both hands flat against the table. Her arms were shaking. It wasn't something a stranger would have noticed, but the linen shivered faintly under her palms, and the 3 of us at that table, Clifford, Reed, and I, all caught it at the same moment. "There's something I need you to hear," Reed said. He moved around the end of the table and positioned himself in front of her, and nothing in his face belonged to the man who had come down that ranch road 3 hours ago, with easy brightness in his voice. "I'm not angry that you had a plan. I'm not angry that you went after what you wanted. There is one thing that I'm angry about." He stopped. One slow, measured breath. "The way you looked at the people in this room tonight. The ones you decided weren't worth your attention. Clifford, Blythe, my father." His voice went quiet on those last 2 words, quiet and heavy. "My father." Natalie's tears had broken through now, tracking down through what was left of her makeup, and she wasn't fighting them anymore. "I didn't know," she said. "Reed, I genuinely didn't know who." That Reed said is exactly the point. Clifford was the first to move. He had stood at that sideboard for the better part of 3 hours without once acting on his own initiative. But he set the water pitcher down now, and with 2 slow, deliberate movements, straightened the cuffs of his shirt, a small ritual I'd seen him perform across 3 decades when he needed to make sure his hands were going to behave, and he walked out into the middle of the room. He came to a stop between Natalie and the door. His voice, when it came, was unhurried and level. Clifford had never required volume to command a room. "Ma'am," he said, 31 years I've worked for this family. I was here the season the bank came close to taking this land from us. I was here the winter Mr. Calloway put in 18-hour days for 4 months running to keep the livestock alive through a drought that wiped out half the cattle operations in Patrick County. Something in his cadence made it feel less like speech and more like testimony, words drawn up from somewhere deep and long settled. I was here the morning Mrs. Calloway came back from Roanoke and told no one what the doctors had found. She went straight to the vineyard and worked the vines for 2 hours before she ever came back through that door. A single beat of silence. I have eaten at this table more times than I know how to count, because Mr. Calloway told me 31 years ago, on a month he couldn't make my full pay, that this house was mine too. He said it and he meant it, and he has gone on meaning it every single day since. Natalie sat with her lips parted and her palms pressed flat on the wood and her mascara long gone, and in her eyes was something that hadn't been present at the start of this evening. Something broken open, something exposed, something that had no choice but to keep looking. "The man you asked to take his meal in the kitchen," Clifford said, "has not asked me to do a single thing in 31 years that he wasn't prepared to do with his own hands. I've watched him work fence line in January, cold that would drive most men inside. I've watched him haul machinery out of Pedernales floodwater. I've watched him keep a dying animal company at 2 in the morning, alone in the dark, because he held the belief that nothing on this land should face that kind of hour without someone beside it." His voice shifted then, only a degree, only enough to let what lay beneath it show, and it wasn't anger underneath. It was grief, the kind that has been folded and carried so long it's become part of the body. "And I have watched him take every meal alone at the kitchen table for 4 years, a thermos and a tin plate. Because sitting at this table, this one right here, is something he cannot make himself do without her." Clifford looked at Natalie steadily. "That is the man you wanted out of the room." The silence that followed was the kind you can hear. The candle flames made a faint, persistent sound, fire working through what it needs to sustain itself. Natalie's breath gave out. Just once, one fractured exhale, she pulled back almost instantly, but it had already gotten out. Blythe came through the side door. She'd been in the hallway for a while. I had registered her footsteps going quiet just outside the door some minutes back and understood she was there, waiting, the way Blythe had always understood when to hold back and when to walk in. She crossed the room and took her place beside Clifford and fixed her gaze on Natalie, composed, dry-eyed, without any uncertainty in her. 8 years ago, Blythe said, "My father lost his position the week before my first tuition payment was due at A&M, $34,000. No way to cover it. I hadn't breathed a word to anyone at the school. I was sitting at our kitchen table in Meadows of Dan, trying to work out what I was going to say to my mother. Her voice didn't waver. Her chin didn't drop. The only things she couldn't fully govern were her hands, which she'd locked together in front of her to keep them still. Mr. Calloway appeared at our front door. He was holding a check, $34,000, the full first year's out-of-state tuition. He said, 'Blythe, this is for your schooling. Your father is a good man, and good men go through hard seasons.' He was back in his truck and gone before my mother could get to the door. She held Natalie's gaze for a long moment. He never mentioned it again, not in 8 years. A pause. 'That's the man,' she said, 'nothing more than that.' Reed reached into the breast pocket of his jacket and produced a photograph, small, wallet-sized, the borders gone soft from years of handling, and placed it on the table in front of Natalie, pressing it flat with his open hand. It was me, 1986. 30 years old, standing on what would one day be the North Pasture, at the time a stretch of cedar scrub and red Virginia clay I'd bought for $42,000 with borrowed money and nothing but a handshake to seal it. Boots already caked in mud, hands already marked by the work. Nothing behind me in any direction but open, empty land. Helen had written on the back in her handwriting, the one I'd know anywhere, in any light, the man who built our world from nothing. Natalie lifted the photograph. Her hands were shaking in a way she was no longer concealing, not the tight, controlled trembling from earlier, but something open and unmistakable. She studied the young man in the image, the boots, the bare land stretching out behind him. The look on his face that wasn't quite confidence, it was something more fixed than confidence, something that had already decided and didn't need to be told it was right. She turned it over and read what Helen had written. Whatever passed through her face in that moment wasn't managed. It wasn't assembled for the room. It moved through her the way weather moves through a landscape, and what it left behind was different from what had been there before. Reed stood at the end of the table. "The man you asked to eat in the kitchen," he said, and every word came out low and exact. "Is my father?" One full breath of silence. "He doesn't work here." Another. "He built it. Every post, every wall, every row of vines, all of it built by him, all of it owned by him. And nearly everything you've spent the last 8 months drawing up plans around, it's his." Natalie's mouth came open. The wine glass left her fingers not dropped, just released, and a slow red wash opened across the cream fabric of her dress in a spreading bloom. She never looked down at, because she couldn't take her eyes off my face. For the first time all evening, she was actually looking at me. Not the boots, not the coat, my face. And what was moving in her eyes had nothing of the cool, practiced assessment she'd been running on. Everyone in this room since she walked through the door. No contempt, no calculation. It was the expression of someone who has arrived at an understanding they were not equipped for. "Why," the word came out barely held together, "why didn't you just say so?" I looked at her across the table Helen had occupied for 30 years in the room. Helen had charged with warmth and noise, and the smell of whatever she had, going on the stove under the chandelier, Helen had driven to Roanoke on a Tuesday to track down. "You never once asked who I was," I said. "You settled that question the moment you saw my boots, and then you spent the whole evening collecting evidence that you were right." Natalie set the photograph down on the table. She did it the way a person handles something once they understand too late that it was precious, with the slow, deliberate care of someone who has just realized that everything around them is more breakable than it looked when they arrived, including themselves. Her fingers let go of the tablecloth slowly, the way you release something that has singed you. She looked across the table at me, not at my boots, not at the coat, not at the mud dried on the floor beside my chair, at my face. For the first time all evening, her eyes were swollen and bare, every layer she'd come in wearing gone. "I owe you an apology," she said. Her voice was thin and barely holding together, wrung out like cloth. "What I said tonight, asking you to take your meal in the kitchen, the things I said about where you come from, I had no right. I understand that. I understand it right now in a way I can't take back." "No," I said, "you can't." She flinched. I think she'd been expecting something gentler, the kind of grace people offer when they believe a person has genuinely reckoned with what they've done. But there are things an apology cannot repair, because the apology, however real, comes after the fact, and what it can't reach is what the words showed about the person who spoke them. Reed settled back into his chair across from her. He lifted his phone from the table without looking at her. "There's more," he said. Natalie pressed both hands over her face, the gesture of someone begging the world to hold still for just 30 seconds. "Read, please." The message to Amber wasn't the only one. He moved his thumb across the screen. "You sent a series of messages to your mother the night after your first visit to the ranch 6 weeks ago, the afternoon trip, when I walked you through the property for the first time." Natalie's hands came down from her face. "That afternoon," Reed said, not accusing, simply recounting the way you state the weather. "You went out to the vineyard while I was on a call. You photographed the boundary markers, the access road on the eastern end, the live oak. You sent 41 photographs to your mother with measurements and notes." He looked up at her. Her response was, "This is better than the Galax property. Start working on Reed." The sound that came from Natalie had no word in it. It was the sound a person makes when the ground they were standing on stops being there. "I was being thorough," she said. Her voice split down the middle on the last word. "I was trying to come in prepared." "That's not—" "Your mother contacted a property law attorney in Roanoke 6 weeks ago," Blythe said. Every head turned. Blythe had moved toward the doorway. her folder still in her hands, her posture carrying the look of someone who has decided that what they're holding can no longer stay inside it. A property law specialist, Blythe continued. She was asking specifically about community property law in Virginia. She looked at Natalie not unkindly, not with any score to settle, just with the clear, level eyes of someone delivering something that needs to be said. In Virginia, community property law generally holds that assets acquired during a marriage are jointly owned. However, and this is what your mother's attorney was specifically researching, property acquired before the marriage or received as inheritance is typically treated as separate property and not subject to division. Natalie stared at her. Your mother was asking, Blythe said, whether a prenuptial agreement could be challenged after the fact, whether a spouse who had contributed to the management or improvement of a separate property could later establish a claim to it. She was looking for the legal opening that would give your family standing to this ranch, even if Mr. Calloway had protections in place before any marriage happened. The fire had burned itself low. The room had cooled over the past hour without anyone noticing, and nobody had thought to put more wood on, and nobody was thinking about it now. She was looking for the gap in the fence, Clifford said from across the room. His voice was quiet, worn. Before the fence was even standing, Natalie's chest rose sharply, the involuntary catch of someone whose lungs have gone tight. I didn't know the specifics of what she was doing. I knew she was making inquiries. I knew she was looking out for me. I didn't know who she was calling or what exactly she was researching. Did you ask? Reed said. Natalie's mouth closed. Did you tell her to stop? He held her gaze. Did you call her and say, Mom, whatever you're doing right now, I need you to end it because I'm with Reed, because I love Reed, and I don't want any part of this. Reed's voice had not climbed a single degree the entire evening. It didn't climb now, but it had taken on a quality flat final without a trace of warmth that was worse than any raised voice would have been. Did you do that at any point across 8 months? The tears were back on Natalie's face, and she had stopped trying to manage them. Her makeup was long gone. Without it, she looked younger, less certain, more like whoever was living beneath the person she'd been presenting all evening. She's my mother, Natalie said. You don't just tell your mother to. You don't ask the man who owns the property to take his dinner in his own kitchen either, Reed said. But tonight you did that without pausing for a breath. Blythe's eyes filled. She pressed her lips together, hard turned her face toward the ceiling for a moment, and breathed through it. Then she brought her gaze back to Natalie, and what was in it wasn't contempt. It was something far more difficult to receive than contempt. It was grief, the specific grief of someone who sees clearly what has just been destroyed and mourns it even though it wasn't theirs to lose. He paid for my education, Blythe said again quietly. Not to make a point, just because it was needed. A pause. My father wept when he found out. He said he didn't know men like that still existed. She looked at me. I didn't either, not until I came to work here. She walked out. Her footsteps crossed the hall. The kitchen door closed behind her without a sound. The room held the silence of a place where something has just come to its conclusion. Natalie sat with her hands folded in her lap, her shoulders drawn slightly inward, not for effect, not perform, just the quiet, involuntary collapse of a person who has spent all the energy they had for holding themselves upright. She looked at Reed. What is it you want me to say? She asked. The question was real. All the scaffolding was down. It was a genuine question from someone who had run out of ground to stand on. I can't undo this evening. I can't undo what my mother did. None of it can be made into something different than it is. Reed looked at me. I gave him nothing. It wasn't mine to give. He turned back to Natalie. His hand moved into his jacket pocket and closed around something. He left it there a moment without drawing it out. There's one more thing, he said, and then we're finished. Reed set his phone on the table face up. He found what he was looking for and turned the screen toward Natalie so she could read it herself. He didn't read it out loud. He had already read enough out loud tonight to last the two of them a very long time. Natalie looked at the screen. Her face didn't fall. Gradually it went all at once, the way a structure gives out when the thing holding it up finally lets go. Her hand came up to cover her mouth, and something escaped around it that she couldn't hold back high and fractured the sound of someone watching a door swing shut that they have no hope of reaching in time. That's from 5 weeks ago, Reed said. The week after the afternoon visit, the week after the photographs. What was on the screen was a message from Natalie to her mother. Reed had already shown most of it, but this part he'd saved: the way you hold your strongest card until the last trick, until the table is empty and there is nothing left to question. Once we're married and my name is on the deed, the old rancher won't be able to do anything about it. He'll just have to accept it. That's how it works." Natalie could not speak. "The deed," Reed said. "Not the company, not the operation. The deed. You knew the difference between the two. You understood exactly what you were saying." He picked up the phone and slid it back into his pocket. "You knew the land itself was what mattered, and you were counting on marriage to get to it." Reed, her voice had been destroyed, left with nothing to stand on. "Reed, I know what that looks like on paper. I know. But I need you to hear me out. Whatever I said to my mother, whatever she was doing in my name, what I feel for you has nothing to do with any of that. Both of those things can exist at the same time. People aren't simple. People can want something and still mean it genuinely. My father built a levee in floodwater to save the South pasture. Reed said he was in the Pedernales up to his chest at 2 a.m. in November alone. He didn't reach out to a single soul. He just went and did what the land demanded of him. And that is what he has done without fail every day for 40 years. His voice shifted then, only slightly, only enough to let something escape that had been held behind the calm all night. "And you sat across from him at that table tonight and asked him to eat in the kitchen after he'd spent the whole day mending a fence in the rain, so that this place you were already drawing your name across would still be standing the way it ought to be." Natalie was shaking her head, not in denial, but in that helpless, repetitive way of someone whose body has taken over and won't stop. A fine, uncontrollable tremor had moved through her from her hands up into her shoulders and all the ways down. "I'm sorry," she said. "I am so sorry. For tonight. For what my mother did. For all of it. I want the ring back." The words brought everything to a halt. Natalie looked at Reed with eyes so swollen they could barely part. "What?" "The ring." Reed's voice was flat and even. "I'd like you to give it back to me." Her voice broke completely on his name, split clean through and came apart. "You're going to throw everything away because of one dinner, because of one night." I'm ending it," Reed said, "because tonight you stopped pretending. And I'm grateful for that. I mean that sincerely, because I have spent 8 months doubting what was right in front of me. Tonight, I don't have to doubt anymore." Natalie's hand moved to the ring on its own, her right hand dropping over her left, pressing the diamond hard against her finger, as if sheer pressure could keep it there. Her knuckles drained white. "If I had known," she said. The tears were coming so fast now they were falling from her chin. "If I had known he was your father, if I had known any of this tonight would have been completely different. You have to believe that." "I do believe it," Reed said. "That's exactly the problem." The silence that followed was total. Natalie looked at me. I was still seated at the head of the table, hands resting on the wood boots flat on the floor, the same as I had been when she first walked into this room and made her decision about who I was. I had not moved. I had not changed. I was the same man in the same chair with the same boots and the same mud and the same 40 years of this land carried in my hands and my back and my bones. She held my eyes for a long moment. Then she reached down and worked the ring off her finger. It came off slowly. Her hands were swollen from weeping, and it took some effort. In that stretch of time, the only sounds in the room were the low burn of the fire, the rain pressed against the window glass, and the particular quiet of 3 people waiting for something to finally be done. She set it on the table. The diamond caught the candlelight for one bright instant before Reed's hand came down over it. Below the table, nearly swallowed by shadow, Natalie's right hand found her phone. Her thumb flew across the screen in a rapid, desperate string of taps, a message going out to her mother. Because when everything else has fallen away, people reach for the last person they still believe is in their corner. She thought the ring was the worst of it. She had no idea what was still coming. Reed's phone lit up at 9:14. The name on the screen was Celeste Dunbar, and it glowed there on the oak table between us, like something that had been biding its time all evening, which, as it turned out, it had been. Reed looked at the screen, then slid the phone across the table to me without a word. Natalie saw it happen. Her breath snagged a sharp, audible intake she couldn't hold back, and she reached forward with one open hand, palm out as though she could physically arrest what was about to unfold. "Reed, don't let me. I'll talk to her. Let me be the one to—" "She didn't call for you," Reed said. He gave a nod in my direction. I picked up the phone. I pressed the green button. I laid it face up on the table between all 3 of us and let Celeste Dunbar's voice into the room. "Reed." Hers was the voice of a woman who had spent a lifetime using confidence as a load-bearing wall, assured polished carrying the particular authority of someone accustomed to being the most prepared person in any room she entered. Whatever is happening between you and Natalie tonight, I need you to set it aside for the moment. We are too far into this project to let a personal disagreement derail the business side. The lease agreement for the vineyard section needs to move forward on the timeline we discussed. I have investors waiting on a signed term sheet. The fire had burned down to coals. The room was quiet enough that Celeste's voice reached every corner. "Mrs. Dunbar," I said. 3 seconds of silence from the other end of the line, the particular silence of someone who has just heard an unexpected voice and is rapidly recalculating everything. "This is Eugene Calloway." Another silence, longer this time. I could hear her breathing controlled, measured the breathing of a woman, forcing herself to think before she spoke. "Mr. Calloway." Her voice had changed. Not dramatically, Celeste Dunbar was too disciplined for that, but the easy authority had receded slightly like a tide pulling back from shore. "I wasn't aware you'd be part of this conversation. I imagine there are quite a few things about tonight that didn't go the way you planned," I said. Reed was watching me from across the table. Natalie had both hands pressed flat on the tablecloth in front of her eyes, fixed on the phone. Her face the face of someone watching a controlled demolition proceed exactly as engineered. "Mr. Calloway," Celeste said, recovering smoothly. "I think if we could arrange a meeting at your convenience, perhaps in Charlotte, or I'm happy to come out to Floyd, we could discuss the vineyard project properly. I believe there's been some misunderstanding about the nature of our proposal, and I'd welcome the chance to clear that up. I reviewed your company's payment history with contractors in Patrick and Carroll counties," I said. "Going back 26 months, you have 14 outstanding delayed payments to local families. One of those families, the Merritts over in Meadows of Dan, waited 19 weeks for a check on a job your company approved and received. Boyd Merritt had to sell a truck he'd owned for 11 years to cover his operating costs while he waited." Celeste was quiet. "Boyd Merritt has worked this land," I said. "Not my land specifically, but this land, Blue Ridge land, the kind of land that calls for the kind of people who show up in the rain and fix what needs fixing and never ask to be thanked for it. His father worked it before him. I have known Boyd Merritt for 22 years. I picked up my water glass. I don't do business with companies that treat people like Boyd Merritt as a line item to be managed. Mr. Calloway, I understand your concern, and I want you to know that any payment delays were the result of internal accounting issues that have since been the vineyard section you were proposing to lease," I said. "I signed a priority agreement with the Blue Ridge Farmers Cooperative 8 weeks ago. That agreement gives the cooperative the right of first consideration on any lease or development arrangement for that section of the property for the next 15 years. I set the glass back down. That agreement was recorded at the Patrick County Clerk's office on September the 9th in Virginia. Recording a real property agreement at the county clerk's office makes it part of the public record and binding on any subsequent party, which means your attorneys will find it the moment they pull the title search Monday morning. There was never a path to the vineyard for your company, Mrs. Dunbar, not from the day you started planning. The silence on the other end of the line was a different quality now, not the calculating silence of before, something hollower, something that understood it had just run out of moves. Natalie's knuckles were white against her mouth, her fist pressed there like she was holding something in, eyes shut. A single tear cut a line down her left cheek and dropped onto the tablecloth, bleeding outward in a slow, dark stain. "There is one more thing," I said. "The portion of the vineyard your team designated as the main event space, that ground surrounding the old live oak at the heart of the property." I let one breath go before I continued. "My wife rests there, Mrs. Dunbar, Helen Ann Calloway. When she was dying, she asked to be laid in the vineyard she had planted with her own hands, so she could remain near the thing she had poured her life into. She has been in that ground for 4 years now." I kept my voice even. I had to, because the words I was speaking were bigger than whatever I was feeling, and I would not let my grief interrupt them. "That soil, the very ground your daughter had written a wedding venue onto. By month 8, that is my answer. To you, to any party at any moment going forward." There was nothing on the line for 4 full seconds. Then Celeste Dunbar said, "I see." The authority entirely gone from her voice, every trace of it drained away. Then the call was over. The screen on Reed's phone went black against the table. He reached over and flipped it face down. Natalie hadn't shifted an inch. Her Her fist was still at her lips, her eyes still pressed shut, the wet line of that tear still visible on her cheek. She had the look of someone who has just heard a door lock from the other side and understood finally that she was not the one holding the key. Clifford moved to the sideboard and lifted the water pitcher still full, the very pitcher Natalie had told him to swap out nearly 2 hours before, and topped off my glass without a word from me. He set it back. One hand smoothed the sideboard cloth with a small, unhurried adjustment. Then his gaze moved to Natalie, and what lived in his expression was not anything close to satisfaction or victory. It was the heavy, bone-tired grief of a man who has witnessed the ruin of something that never had to be ruined, who knows it was brought about entirely by decisions that were made well before this evening ever began. Reed rose and crossed the room to the front door and swung it open. Cold air rolled in, carrying the scent of cedar soaked through with rain, and that clean, sharp quality the air gets after a Virginia storm has passed through. "Natalie," Reed said, standing in the doorway. "It's time." No edge to it. No cruelty, no softness either. Just the plainest words left to him, said by a man who no longer had any cause to hold off what was already settled. Natalie worked her chair back from the table. The legs caught on the oak floor and dragged, and the sound was wrong for the room too, blunt too absolute like punctuation, being set down at the end of something that had been building since the first course. She got to her feet. She swayed slightly, nothing that announced itself, nothing requiring a steadying hand, but the kind of unsteadiness that belongs to someone whose body has absorbed more than her mind has yet processed. Both hands found the top of her chair and gripped it for a moment before she released it. She retrieved her bag from beside her chair. Her hands moved over her coat, straightening it in small, practiced adjustments. The automatic reflex of a woman whose whole life has included checking how she presents herself before entering or leaving any space. Even stripped of everything else, she did not glance at Clifford. She did not glance at me. She walked toward where Reed stood in the doorway and stopped, turned around. From across that long table, she looked at me past the candles burned nearly to nothing, past the water glasses, past what remained of the meal Clifford had prepared from Helen's recipe, past the photograph Reed had set face up on the table and never retrieved. The young man with mud on his boots standing on bare land and Helen's handwriting on the back. "I'm sorry," Natalie said. The words had almost no volume behind them. "I know saying that repairs nothing. I know the timing makes it worth less than it ought to be. But I mean it. What I'm sorry for isn't what I walked away from tonight. It's the way I spoke to you in this room. You were owed better than that. It was real. I could tell that plainly enough. There are apologies that arrive after the damage is past fixing, and yet they are still honest. This was one of those. I wasn't going to act as if it wasn't. I know I said. And I hope this evening stays with you for a good long while. Not out of any wish to see you hurt by it, but because the next time you size up a person in the first 10 seconds, decide who they are, what they deserve. I hope something makes you slow down and ask one more thing before you close the book on them." Natalie gave a small nod. Her chin shook with it. She turned toward the doorway again and moved through the entryway, and at the front door she stopped one last time. The old wooden hook, Helen's gardening gloves, hanging right where Clifford had returned them hours before. That same coat rack where Natalie had let her bag drop on the way in and sent those gloves to the floor without a second thought. She stood there looking at them, her arm lifted slow and deliberate, and her fingers settled against the worn leather, a light touch barely there just a moment. Then her hand fell away. She went through the screen door, and her footsteps descended the porch steps, and the night took her. Reed stood in the doorway until her headlights crossed the face of the house and disappeared along the ranch road. Then the screen door swung shut, and he came back inside. Out in the dark past, the porch edge, something moved low to the ground, closing fast. Paws on wet grass, then on the porch boards, and then Huck was at the door, his gray muzzle working against the screen, his tail going in wide, frantic sweeps, soaked clear through and delighted about none of it. Reed pulled the door open, and Huck came in, all at once cold air, wet coat, and a happiness so complete it had no manners, spinning and shaking himself down the full length of his body, right there in the entryway, sending water across the floorboards in every direction. "Hey, buddy," I said. "Hey." He closed the gap between us in about 4 strides, pushed into my leg, drove his wet nose into my open hand. I laid my palm on his head and felt the solid, uncomplicated weight of a creature that has always been entirely itself. Clifford came out of the hallway, holding a small sealed envelope, cream-colored my name on the front. In handwriting I recognized the moment I saw it. He extended it toward Reed. "You gave this to me 5 years ago," Clifford said. "Told me I would know when the right moment came to hand it over." He held Reed's gaze with the look of a man who has tended something with great care over a long stretch and is grateful finally to set it down. "Tonight is that moment, I think. Reed." Reed accepted the envelope and studied the writing on the front, not mine as it turned out. Helen's. The name she had called him since he was 3 years old, back when she had concluded that the full version carried too many syllables for the size of what she felt. His grip tightened around it. "What is this?" he asked. "There's a letter," Clifford said, "and paperwork your mother drew up before the illness took hold. She practiced law for 15 years before she ever set foot on this land. Then she spent around 6 months seeing to it that everything your father had spent his life building was wrapped in protections no one could pick apart, not for any reason, not by anyone." Clifford's voice dropped quieter with the remembering. "She told me, 'Clifford, this land took 40 years to build, and I am not going to let it take 40 seconds to lose.' And she meant every word. She left nothing to chance." Reed drew the envelope in against his chest, both hands holding it flat. The way a person holds something they know they're not ready to open and yet cannot set aside. He looked across the room at me. "Dad," he said. And that was all. The moment didn't need anything more than that. I pushed myself up out of the chair. My boots had left a pair of dried mud prints on the floor right where I'd been sitting the whole long evening. I looked at them for a beat, then looked at my son. "Come on," I said. "We'll move to the kitchen. Clifford can warm the coffee up." Clifford laid 2 mugs on the kitchen table, topped off the thermos, and left the room without being asked. He understood. 31 years had given him that he always understood when a room belonged to the people left in it. Reed settled in across from me, his hands wrapped around his mug, the envelope resting between us on the table, still closed. He looked down at it. "The way you look at something you know is going to cost you not money, not time, but the particular version of yourself that exists right before you open it. I let things go too long tonight," he said. "I sat there while she spoke to you that way, and I need you to know that's something I'll be carrying. You let it run far enough that doubt didn't have anywhere left to stand. That matters," I said. "But Reed, don't you ever hold your tongue while someone treats the people you loved that way. Not for strategy, not to build a case, not for any reason on this earth. You understand me?" One hard nod. "I kept telling myself I had it wrong about her," he said. "That I was reading things into her behavior, that she was nervous and it was showing up sideways." He stopped. "I needed to be wrong, same as you needed it. That's not a flaw in you," I said. "That's what it looks like when someone is carrying a real heart inside their chest. The other way of being is worse." Reed picked up the envelope and broke the seal, taking it slowly apart. Inside was a letter in Helen's handwriting. The handwriting I could have identified in the dark, the same script I had spent decades reading on recipe cards on the backs of photographs, on the notepad she kept beside the telephone. Beneath it sat a stack of legal documents, each section marked with small colored tabs, the way Helen tabbed everything when she was serious. He read the letter through without a word. When he finished, he held it in both hands and said nothing for nearly a full minute. "She says she's not worried about the land," he finally said. His voice had gone thick and low, and sounded nothing like any version of it I had heard all evening. "She says to pay attention to how a person treats someone who can't do a thing for them. She says that's the whole test every time." He laid the letter down with care. "She wrote this 3 weeks before she died." "I know," I said. Huck came in from the hallway and set his muzzle against Reed's knee with the certainty of an animal that has no doubt where it belongs. Reed's hand settled onto Huck's head and stayed. We sat without speaking for a stretch. The rain had let up. Out through the kitchen window, the Blue Ridge was doing what it always does after a hard storm, falling into that deep stillness, the kind that only comes to a place that has been rinsed all the way through. I pushed back my chair and stood. "You going to bed?" Reed asked. "Not yet," I said. "I want to walk the north fence. That rain came down harder than I counted on. I'll come with you?" "Stay," I said. "Go through what your mother put together. She gave 6 months to that work, and she did it right. It earns your full attention." Reed looked at the stack of documents on the table. Then he looked up at me. Something passed across his face, not quite a word, but the thing underneath a word, the part that carries more weight than the word ever could. "Dad," he said. Just that. Nothing after. One word in the voice of a 30-year-old man, who was also somehow still the boy who had walked these fields alongside me in boots 3 sizes too big, asking if we were rich. "I know," I said. "Me too." I pulled my jacket off the hook beside the back door. I settled onto the bench in the mudroom and laced up my boots, the same pair Helen had bought. The winter we stopped losing sleep over the electric bill, the ones she had handed over saying, "When these wear out, that means we've made it." Restitched twice in 12 years. The waterline from the 2011 flood still faint above the ankle. The left toe cracked from 10,000 mornings that looked exactly like this one. We had made it. I pushed open the back door, and the Blue Ridge came in cold cedar dark, carrying the smell of soaked earth and washed grass, and that particular cleanness that only exists in the hour before dawn, when the world hasn't yet remembered it has anything to be. Huck was at my heel before I'd cleared the threshold. We went out together into the soft ground, the old dog, and the man who had built everything standing behind us out of nothing. And somewhere past the tree line, the first birds were beginning, and the sky to the east had shifted from black to that deep blue. That means the dark is almost spent. I did not look back toward the house. I had no need to. I knew precisely what was there. That morning, going out into the Blue Ridge with Huck at my side and the boots Helen had chosen on my feet, I understood something I ought to have understood sooner. I had waited too long. I told myself it was strategy, that I needed proof, that I needed to be certain. That morning, walking out into the dark with Huck at my heel, I wasn't thinking about winning. I was thinking about Helen, about the boots she'd picked out, about a letter she'd written 3 weeks before she died, still looking after everything she loved. This story cost something to live through, but I believe God puts the truth in front of us, exactly when we're ready to see it, not a day sooner. What Eugene built wasn't just land and fence line. It was a life assembled one honest day at a Heimstoi, and Helen made sure it couldn't be taken apart by anyone who hadn't earned the right to touch it. That's the part that stays with me, the patience of it, the quiet, unglamorous faithfulness of 2 people who just kept showing up. If these grandpa revenge stories remind you of anyone, a father, a grandfather, someone who never asked for credit and never stopped working, then you already understand what this one was really about. Here is what I'd want you to take with you. Watch how a person treats someone who can't do anything for them. That's the whole test every time. Don't let anyone rush you into a decision about your land, your family, or your legacy. Slow is often the most powerful move available. When someone you love builds something with their whole life, protect it the way they would have, carefully and without apology. And if you're ever tempted to write someone off in the first 10 seconds, stop. Ask one more question. You may be looking at the person who built everything you're standing on. These father stories matter because the men in them rarely told anyone how much they were carrying. They just carried it. If this one moved you, leave a comment and tell me what part landed hardest. Share it with someone who needs to hear it today. And if you haven't yet come join us here on Grandpa's Revenge, there are more stories where this one came from. Thank you for being here. I'll see you in the next one.